Ibus Mark 462 Midterm Preparation Essay Questions. First question. What is globalization? During the recent past, say 10 years, what have been the major drivers of globalization? Is globalization a zero-sum game? If so, why? If not, why not? Are Canadians better off as a result of globalization? Using specific examples, explain why or why not. Globalization refers to a shift toward a more integrated, interdependent world economy. Globalization has several facets, including the globalization of markets and the globalization of production. On an economic and business level, globalization refers to the increased mobility of goods, services, labor, technology, and capital throughout the world. Drivers of globalization. Two macro factors underlie the trend toward greater globalization. The first is the decline in barriers to the free flow of goods, services, and capital that has occurred since the end of World War II. The second factor is technological change, particularly the dramatic developments in recent decades in communication, information processing, and transportation technologies. If globalization is a zero-sum game, is still debatable depending on the country. There are many advantages of globalization. From a broad perspective, globalization creates economic activity which stimulates economic growth, creates jobs, raises income levels, provides consumers with more choices in regard to the products and services that are available to them. From the perspective of an individual firm, globalization has the potential to increase revenues through expanded market potential, drive down costs through additional economies of scale, and boost profits. However, critics argue that globalization destroys manufacturing jobs in wealthy countries and contributes to pollution since it encourages firms from advanced nations to move manufacturing facilities offshore to less developed countries to avoid the more stringent pollution controls in place in their home countries. Also, falling trade barriers allow firms in industrialized countries to move their manufacturing activities offshore to countries where wage rates are much lower. Are Canadians better off as a result of globalization? Using specific examples, explain why or why not. Canada is heavily connected to and dependent on the rest of the world. More than two-thirds of Canadians use the internet. More than two-thirds of television viewing time is devoted to foreign programming. Foreigners have invested more than $500 billion in Canada. Exports, mostly to the United States, amount to more than 40% of Canada's gross domestic product, or GDP. Canada is a member of 14 international organizations, second only to the US, which is a member of 15. Then the implications are: globalization has benefited some Canadians and hurt others, who, for example, lost their jobs to Mexicans after the NAFTA agreement. Overall, Canadian efficiency, competition, and economy are said to be better. Okay, second question. As governments often intervene in international trade, identify and briefly describe 4 ways that governments conduct international trade intervention. In your opinion, why do they do this, and outline why you think government intervention is a good or bad thing? Who does it benefit most and least? 4 ways in which government intervenes are tariffs, subsidies, quotas, and voluntary export restraints. Tariffs. Tariffs. A tariff is a tax levied on imports or exports that effectively raise the cost of imported products relative to domestic products. By raising the price of imported products, in most cases, tariffs are placed to protect domestic producers from foreign competition. Tariffs fall into two categories: specific tariffs, which are a fixed charge for each unit of an imported good, for example, $3 per barrel of oil. And the other one is ad valorem tariffs, which is a percentage of the value of the imported good, example, 10%. Who are the winners and losers due to tariffs? The government gains because the tariff increases government revenues. Domestic producers also gain because the tariff affords them some protection against foreign competitors by increasing the cost of imported foreign goods. But consumers lose because they must pay more for certain imported goods. And finally, the overall efficiency of the world economy is reduced. Okay, now the second way are subsidies. You can see these also in question number 10 of the definitions. Subsidies are government payments to domestic producers. Subsidies take many forms, including cash grants, low-interest loans, and government equity participation in domestic firms. By lowering production costs, subsidies help domestic producers in two areas. First, competing against low-cost foreign imports, and second, gaining export markets. Agriculture tends to be one of the largest beneficiaries of subsidies in all countries. The main gains from subsidies accrue to domestic producers whose international competitiveness is increased as a result, and the main losses from subsidies are accrued to consumers who typically absorb its costs. Now the third way that a government intervenes in trade are the import quotas. Import quotas are a direct restriction on the quantity of some good that may be imported into a country. For example, the United States has a quota on cheese imports. The only firms allowed to import cheese are certain trading companies, each of which is allocated the right to import a maximum number of pounds of cheese each year. The fourth way are the voluntary export restraints. You can see these also in question number 15 of the definitions. Voluntary export restraints, which are also the VERs, are quotas on trade imposed by the exporting country, usually at the request of the importing country's government. One of the most famous historical examples is the limitation on auto exports to the United States enforced by Japanese automobile producers. Both import quotas and voluntary export restraints benefit domestic producers by limiting import competition. As with all restrictions on trade, quotas do not benefit consumers. An import quota or a voluntary export restraint always raises the domestic price of an imported good. And there is an additional form of government intervention in trade, which is the local content requirement. You can see this also in question number 6 of the definitions. A local content requirement is a requirement that some specific fraction of a good be produced domestically. Developed countries have also used them to try to protect local jobs and industry from foreign competition. In my opinion, having government trade intervention is a good thing. The reasons for this are: government trade intervention protects jobs, reduces unemployment. It also protects industries from unfair foreign competition. For example, the tariffs placed on imports of foreign steel. Government intervention protects certain industries because they are important for national security, like defense-related industries, for example, aerospace. Governments also help in retaliation, where threats are used to intervene in trade policy as a bargaining tool to help open foreign markets and force trading partners to play fair. For example, get the Chinese government to enforce its intellectual property laws. The government also protects consumers from unsafe products by limiting or banning the import of such products. For example, Japan banning beef mad cow. The infant industry argument. Many developing countries have potential comparative advantages, but are unable to compete with developed countries. The governments in this case should temporarily support new industries with tariffs, import quotas, and subsidies until they have grown strong and gained maturity and knowledge to stay innovative and efficient. The downfall is that political intervention often hurts consumers and it can be self-defeating.